now to the support?
Yes, you are good to go. We should start seeing attendees arrive.
Okay. All right. There they are. All right, we begin now then? All right. Well, welcome to the session on the Cuban economy, Cuba-Venezuela Interactions. I'm not going to spend any time with any significant introduction here. I want to be able to proceed as soon as possible, so we maximize the time we have at the end for questions from the attendees. So the first paper will be presented by Larry Katabaker, and it's Cuba's response to COVID-19 and the consequences for Cuba and the pandemic. Larry?
Well, thank you very much, and apologies for not having a paper to you, but hopefully I'll be able to make it up with some colorful slides, if only to amuse you. The hardest part of this presentation, of course, is going to be getting the slides up. So if you give me a second to try to put them up. Let's see if I can do this in a way that, all right, let me share screen. All right, and I think I can do this. All right, do you all see the screen? Do you all see the screen? Folks? Hello?
Yes, we can see
your
it.
screen is sharing.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I can't see you guys, so oh, there you are. That's very helpful. And again, I'm sorry I'm on two screens, so if I'm not looking directly at the camera, it's not because I don't like you all or I think that this is a better shot of my face. It's the screens on the other side. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be on the panel and to talk about something that's actually quite interesting, although it tends to be ignored certainly over the last year, and that is Cuba's response to COVID and COVID-19. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about what makes Cuba unique and why it's worth paying attention. And of course, this requires a little bit of work because as we know over the course of the last year, most of the attention about COVID has been focused on great powers and great tragedies. Everyone likes the A-list players. Everyone loves the A-list countries. Narratives, global narratives are all based on what does China do? What does the EU do? And then every once in a while we deal with the poor folks. But most of the attention has been on the great powers, the great tragedies. This is the view of the popular press. And it's certain, and by certain states, and certainly as a test for legitimacy and the strength of a political system. And we've seen that, especially in the United States and in China, but we've seen that within the European Union as well, as the Swedish versus the English versus the German-French model has played out in the press. Now, these battles also, as we know, underlie an even more interesting battle, and that is what I call the battle of simulations, the battles of simulacra between those that maximize the economic, the preservation of economic potency in the context of COVID challenges to those that are focused almost primarily on health. We saw that explode. The Chinese have been very good at hiding this. We saw that this explode in the battles within the Trump administration in June and July over which model to use in order to determine what American COVID policy was. But that tends to be what we've been looking at, this battle of simulation, policy shaped again to preserve health of the population versus policy shaped by the need for viable economic systems. And in all of this, of course, much less attention is paid to the developing world, with two exceptions. One is sensationalism and tragedy. Everyone loves, especially the New York Times, although I shouldn't beat them up specifically, but everyone loves sensationalism and tragedy. So you get a bunch of people dying in a developing country, that'll make news for a nanosecond. Or where the news media of a particular state does not like a particular leader, and when bad things happen in that country, it's a wonderful way to put it all on them. This of course occurred with the American press and the Brazilians. But beyond that, there's relatively little. So it's worth looking at. And Cuba in particular is a unique case study. Yes, worth looking at. It's a very odd state. For those who study Cuba, they understand this, but it's worth highlighting it. It has many of the characteristics of a developing state, but it also shares a number of characteristics and sensibilities of a developed state. So it's a strange place, a country that doesn't know its place and is placed in a sense in the best and worst possible positions as both in the context of the best and worst of developing and developed states. Of course, all of this is then mediated through the conflict with the United States, which adds a little bit of spice to this. And it is mediated further by a large debate, and now an international debate about medical internationalism and the nexus of state appropriation of labor and its exploitation versus growing international sensibilities of the nature of labor rights as inherent in the individual. And these tensions, and of course, there are tensions between protecting the populations and populations that are exposed in ways that can't be helped, as well as the interactions between economic and health policies. All of these are highlighted in Cuba. And so Cuba makes a very nice place in which you can understand this. And so that's what we're going to look at. And what I will do is I'll look at the history of the pandemic in Cuba. I will try to point out some of the more interesting ramifications and trajectories. And by interesting, I mean something that is not quite what we have seen play out in the big three players, the Americans, the Europeans, and the Chinese, and then see if we can draw some conclusions from it. So we'll start with just a brief history of the pandemic. And of course, the pandemic has a way of punishing. It's for those of you who saw the movie World War Z, it sort of works the same way. The disease goes through your strongest vector, and that was no different in Cuba. How did the pandemic actually go into Cuba? The famous story, I think it was the Italian tourist, it depends on who you talk to. It's tourism. Tourism is, of course, one of the foundational sectors for Cuban quote unquote prosperity under the 2030 plan. And it was through the vector of tourism that we began to see the pandemic or COVID come in. But it wasn't just tourism, it was this stew of tourism, diasporic travel, Cubans traveling back and forth from countries, especially from European countries at first, and then from the US, internationalism, Cuban doctors returning from medical internationalist programs, and of course, sometimes almost farce, the humanitarianism efforts also produced an exposure to COVID. And of course, this is the saga of the cruise ships. As you recall back, I think it was in March or April, the cruise ships, it really was a horrible, bad movie. Cruise ships with no places to land. The Cubans decided that they were going to exploit this. And there were also humanitarian tendencies. They allowed them to disembark. And then they did a very sloppy job of getting them from the boats where they had been exposed to COVID to planes that would take them to their final destination. So you had this big stew of vectors in tourism, diaspora, internationalism, and humanitarianism, some of which can ultimately be controlled, some of which could not, right? And the consequences were as you'd expect. There was closing borders, then opening border corridors because you need tourists for cash, and then limited reopenings, which is where we're at now. What I call border corridors and limited reopenings are being shut again. We have a huge movement of resources to developing treatments and now vaccines. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And the need, actually the really difficult challenge of keeping the country running in the face of shortages, and the way in which one can reduce the incidence of mortality and the severity, especially in the context where that becomes difficult because of things like water shortages to maintain cleanliness. And then ultimately all of this then devolving after September or October to the issues of maintaining social control. That's a problem that we see not only in Cuba, what we've seen in places in Africa, as well. So all of these things then interact with each other. We have this connection between tourism, diaspora, relations, internationalism, and humanitarian, with the issues of borders, of ramping up of resources for medical treatments, and of keeping the country running in the context of problems of a developing state. Which is with respect to things like hygiene and food. And then, of course, the problems unique to Cuba, or well, not unique to Cuba in a sense, but unique in the Cuban context, but the problem of maintaining not just social control, but maintaining the integrity of the current political economic system, right? So I want to just take a moment to focus on tourism, which was a key element. Tourism is, of course, a critical element of the economy, is central to the 2030 plan, but so was the development of pharma. But this is a big one. It was easy, ready cash, and it dovetailed nicely with the notions of privatizing at least part of the economy. But it was also a key vector for the introduction of the disease, which then dried up the sources of tourist flows and then reduced investment by foreign companies who, that was also a vector for economic development. And the response, of course, in Cuba originally was to encourage local tourism. That can only go a small way to make up the difference. It's very difficult to do that. Diaspora Cubans were effectively cut off, which hurt the private sector. No trade in goods, I'll call it that, no trade in goods, and cut off of cash. And there were collateral effects, of course, restaurants, tour operators, and the like. And of course, and then there was an effort to ameliorate them. The border corridors and the tourist safe zones came in, then opening after September and now closing again in November and December. Cuban medical internationalism also played an interesting role. Of course, it's been controversial for years. As you know, there's a lawsuit that is now moving forward in the, I think it's the federal courts of the District of Columbia, arguing that in fact, the medical internationalism and the use of Cuban doctors is both a violation of ILO conventions and of international law, and it's forced labor. We'll see what happens, but it's proven very effective during the pandemic. Cuba sent its doctors worldwide. They received special focus in Italy, but just a couple of weeks ago, Denmark, the Danish government also applauded the Cubans and Cuban medical internationalism for its contribution to ameliorating the pandemic. At the same time, the program again has been charged with two things. One is forced labor, and two, the use of Cuban doctors as a cover for political work. And that was certainly the case in Venezuela. And people have been very, especially developing states and liberal democratic states in particular, have been very cautious about this. And it ultimately puts a strain, although that's also controversial, on the extent to which Cuba can protect its own populations within Cuba with a bunch of its doctors out. On the other hand, the ratio of doctors to population in Cuba is higher than virtually anywhere else in Latin America. So it's not clear, and we don't have the numbers yet, but it's not clear which way that went. Medical technologies was, of course, the other thing. And when we think about Cuba and COVID, we're thinking about two vectors in the context of disease. One is tourism, one is medical technologies. And of course, again, another of the big four, there were 11, but the big two, the 2030 plan, and COVID accelerated and redirected medical research, deepened partnerships with China and the European states, and as of 2 weeks ago with the Russians, I'll talk about that in a little bit if I have time. The initial efforts after March and April was to repurpose and recycle drugs, but after July, it was also involved in creating new drugs, both in treatment and now in vaccine. Cuba is, again, this is first world versus developing world. Cuba is actually in the race for producing viable vaccines, and we'll see how that goes. And the medical technologies has been used both to make money for Cuba, but at the same time, there's been a lot of political use. Some of this is going free or highly subsidized as well. So Cuba is taking a hit on this. I don't know where they're getting the subsidies for this, but there's been some hits, especially in Cuba's relations with other third world, or sorry, dating myself, other developing countries. That leaves some challenges that we've talked about. Sanitation, food, and economic reform are the big three, right? It's hard to encourage hand washing when there's no water. It is hard to keep social distancing when people have to stand in line for food. And if the state isn't capable of meeting these challenges, then you've got a problem and you develop the cycle. The Cubans have been surprisingly good at limiting the effects of this. One of the few benefits of living on an island is that it's much easier to control input and output, and that has helped. But the potential to increase susceptibility, especially as tourists comes in, remains high, and their ability to meet those challenges becomes more difficult. Food has been a problem for Cuba. This is a problem a generation in the making, and COVID just illuminated the problems that everyone knew were there. Access to food, access to goods, the privileged access to food and goods, depending on where you are on the political hierarchy. And of course, all of this, again, also increases potential susceptibility. And of course, economic reform in the context of COVID. And that has come in two respects. COVID has accelerated reforms that have been on again, off again since 2008. So there's no revolutionary reform here, but on again, off again is back on again, expansion, but in an odd way, both, and to some extent an expansion of the private sector and more flexibility in the operation of the private sector, while maintaining a significant focus and investment in central planning. The much ballyhooed end of the dual currency system has come in, and the need for investment. It's not clear where all of this is going. The propaganda value of this is certainly high. The real value of this going forward is a subject for another day, but it's there. And to some extent, COVID was the accelerator for all of this and will probably shape the taste, the appetite of the government for moving forward with this as well. So I want to end, I know I'm probably running out of time. I've got like 4 or 5 minutes, if I remember correctly. I want to end by looking at where we are at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. And so I'm looking at this again from the perspectives that we've seen, that I've mentioned over the course of the presentation. The first is, of course, the pressure on tourism. Cuba went, whew, thank goodness, we're out of the woods in August and September, and then the surge comes back, and that becomes a problem. The Miami Herald reported a couple days ago that Cuba has had to now include, to begin to cut down on the number of travelers allowed in. And the focus, at least 3 days ago, was the US, Mexico, Panama, Bahamas, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. And they do this by cutting down, sorry about the typo, cutting down on flights. But the lucrative European and Canadian connections are left intact. So it's not clear whether the actual response, given the need for tourism, whether the actual response is is more for show than an actual response to. And now with the super COVID spreading thing, it's not clear where this is going. There's likely to be more. On the other hand, what ameliorates this is the start, and this started actually in Central America. I heard about this first in what the Costa Rican government had required of its tourists, and that is the development of travel insurance, COVID travel insurance. Iberostar on the 15th of December announced that they had complimentary COVID insurance. And essentially what this does is ensure your treatment and your stay, assuming that you test positive for COVID or that you're exposed and you're either quarantined or you have to stay in the hospital facilities there. I suspect that we're going to see a lot of interesting developments in the context of travel insurance in pandemic, and that may substantially change the way in which we look at tourism. The American factor, of course, we have no idea what may be going on. Mr. Trump is going to try to make it much more difficult to move the American position. He's got until the 18th or 19th of January to do it, and President Biden is looking back to the happy days of Mr. Obama. We'll see where that goes. It's not clear, and he may be distracted enough and Cuba may be quiet enough that it remains a backwater and therefore of no interest to the administration. But that may not be actually what happens, and that is because of the X factor, right? One of the more interesting things here is the way in which Cuba, like a lot of developing states, have been using their criminal law to enforce some penalties. Rwanda was on the radar of the international human rights community for using drones to get people who violate the COVID rules, move them into stadiums for 2 or 3 hours of re-education or jailing them, and then jailing political oppositions. Cuba, like a lot of developing countries, has enacted penal laws. In this case, you can be jailed for as long as a year and fined up to 300 pesos for propagation of epidemics. That is similar to what we see in Africa. But the question is whether they are using the criminal law against political opponents. Amnesty came out with a report about this about 2 months ago, and there is some suggestion that indeed the Cubans have been doing this as well. This is a report from Human Rights Watch at the beginning of December. But the big factor is the San Isidro movement. Right? All of a sudden, you have all of, and this becomes a problem, and it is a problem very similar to the American problem with George Floyd. What happens when everyone talks about the need for social distancing and masks? You have a political eruption, and all of that goes out the window, but it's an important political eruption that is in the interest, for example, of the Americans and perhaps of the Cubans as well. How do you deal with this? This remains unresolved. As the government arrests more people, larger protests occur, and that may significantly affect the way in which Cuba is going to be using its criminal law. We'll see. The vaccine politics, 2 interesting developments. I know I'm out of time, so I'm going to go
Out of time, yeah.
All right, very quickly if I can. Cuba is developing its own vaccine. It's Soberana 02 is in phase 2 clinical trials, but they're also getting vaccines through Iran. So Iran is going to purchase vaccines through third parties and then begin the vaccination of the Cubans, which is very interesting. Current outlook, TASS announced on the 14th of December that Russia is carrying out joint research and testing of drugs, and Diaz-Canal talked about nasaferon, so they're interferon drugs that are being developed as well, and so we're going to see that as treatment drugs. And what we see then is an island that basically has all of the benefits and all of the detriments of both a developed and a developing state. I'm out of time, but thank you very much, and appreciate and looking forward to questions and interactions.
Thank you, Larry. I forgot to mention that Larry is from Pennsylvania State University. The next speaker will be Jorge Perez Lopez, and his talk will be Raul's Reforms: What was accomplished, what remains to be done to unlock the Cuban economy.
Thank you, Luis. Happy to be here with you all in 2021. Let me see if I can successfully navigate sharing my screen, which is always an adventure. On what? Screen? Oh, here. Can the support person from ASA help me? I have the screen open, the PowerPoint, but I'm able to.
Yes, I just changed you to co-host, so you should be able to start sharing.
Oh, I can't start yet, okay. Can anybody see my my PowerPoint?
Yes.
You can see it. Well,
Yes, we can see it.
that's encouraging. Okay, is that
Yeah, that's good.
presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, my paper is sort of a paper on economic history, if you will, recent economic history. It stems from a book that Carmelo Mesalago and I wrote a few years ago on Raul's reforms. It seems like yesterday, but it's actually published in 2013, so it's been a while since then. And I've endeavored in this paper to sort of update some of that, put it in a slightly broader framework, and then update it with some more recent developments. As I say in the introduction to the paper, the word reform is not kind of well taken in Cuba. Cuban government doesn't refer to the economic changes as reforms. They talk about updating of the model. They talk about destrabando, that is removing some impediments to economic growth, but reform is not a particularly well-received term. As I said, actualización is what the Cuban government prefers. Now, looking at economic history of Cuba since the revolution, and Carmelo has spent a tremendous amount of time doing this and done it many different times, the economic policy zigzag between what he calls idealist policies, that is, policy cycles where there's an emphasis on socialism and on elimination of market mechanisms altogether. And typically when those fail, there were sort of changes in direction to go to more pragmatist cycles, where they introduce things as revolutionary as market prices determined by demand and supply and agricultural markets, and letting farmers decide how they want, what crops they want to plant and commercialize and so on. So you've had that zigzagging going on pretty much from 1959 and 1960, when socialism began to be implemented in Cuba. There was a significant moment in time in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed and the socialist bloc collapsed, where Cuba actually was in a very difficult economic position. This was called the special period in time of peace, and the Cuban government implemented some fairly important reforms that we might call structural, in the sense that they changed the socialist basis of the economy, and they reforms, lo and behold, which began around 1993, by the end of the decade of the 90s, had brought the economy back from a very bad situation and negative economic growth to somewhat positive growth. And that, of course, led to a sort of pulling back on those reforms. And during the early 2000s, Cuba pretty much dismantled those reforms. The economy, as I said, had improved somewhat. And then, of course, Venezuela came into the picture with massive amounts of foreign assistance to Cuba. And the combination of those two factors, the reforms and the help from Venezuela, gave Cuba, the Cuban leadership, the hardliners, the chance to sort of backtrack on the reforms. So this was called, generally speaking, the battle of ideas. And the idea here was to return to the supremacy of socialism and to really completely do away with those reforms that had been put in place before. So this went through until in the early 2000s, as you all recall. There was a massive global financial crisis, which essentially changed the terms completely. And Cuba was in a position where they had to do something in terms of economic policy going forward. So this is around the time, and I have a fairly, I'm not going to go through all of these points, but there's a timeline that is important to sort of place some of the things that I'm going to be talking about in a historical context. The color coding here, the red things, lines are kind of things related to Fidel, Raúl, sort of the leadership role. The blue are sort of external factors. And then the black ones are sort of domestic policies implemented by Raúl. And again, to go very quickly, in August 2006, Fidel Castro is taken gravely ill. Fidel was about 81 or 82 at the time. He had been ill for a certain amount of time. He is essentially cedes his position to Raúl, but it's not formal. He continues to at least give the impression that he was in command and that everything was going through him. I think that's doubtful, but nevertheless, this was the impression that was given to the people. On July 26, 2007, Raúl sort of, who was now the acting leader of the country, gives a very important speech where he talks about the need for structural and conceptual reforms. And this was unheard of, to have one of the Castros speak about structural and conceptual reforms. Shortly after that, Raúl is formally chosen president of the Council of Ministers, and the country begins to prepare for the 6th Congress of the Communist Party. And in so doing, starts a very extensive consultation with experts. I remember during this time, 2007, meeting with a number of Cuban economists. I think it was in Montreal, where there was an international meeting. And these folks who had not been in the government and were Cuban academics were giddy with excitement about the fact that they were being consulted and that they had been told nothing is taboo, give us your ideas, we want the best, we want to really get your best ideas. Some of that got picked up, of course, in the very important document, Lineamientos de la Política Económica y Social del Partido, which is called the guidelines, which set out over 300 guidelines for reforming the economy, actualizar the economy over the next few years. And this went on with creating the creation of a permanent commission in 2011. And there was a process going on to be able to bring a lot of those reforms, or those changes into the economy. in February 2013, Raul is reelected for a 5-year term. Interestingly, he announces that he will not be a candidate for reelection. So he indicated that he would retire in 2018. There were some doubts about whether he would actually do that or not. Turns out that he did. I think he still wields a certain amount of power from behind the scenes, but he, at a minimum, did live up with that commitment. And of course, we have an external factor here, which is the Obama administration announcement, I think fairly surprisingly, and without a lot of discussion about it outside of the government channels, that there would be a thaw in relations between Cuba and the United States, and that in itself started a process of considerable encouragement to the Cuban private sector, and there were a lot of missions going to Cuba, and there was a lot of possibilities for investment. And I'd say it was a pretty heady period in terms of expectations about how the Cuban economy would change in the future based on a normalization of relations with the United States and the West. Of course, things didn't quite work out that way. Obama visited Cuba, everything looked fine, but I think there was a fair amount of dissatisfaction with the fact that Cuba was not really doing very much at all in response to the openings from the US. And Cuba, I think, was sort of swimming in place. They knew what needed to be done, but the reforms that were kind of next to be taken just never seemed to happen. In 2016, Fidel Castro dies. Then, of course, the Trump administration takes over in January. There's a complete, I think Trump called it cancellation. I don't know exactly how that applies, but cancellation of US policy. And that sort of brought that cycle to its end. In April 2018, Raul Castro retired as president and is substituted by Miguel Díaz-Canel. So during what I call the period of Raul reforms, which is basically the period 2007 to 2017, there were 3 kinds of categories of economic actions taken by the government. One is, and this taxonomy comes from the book with Carmelo, administrative measures, which were just essentially reorganization of ministries and things of that nature, supposedly to improve economic efficiency through administration. There were some what we call non-structural changes. Some of the Cuban economists call this elimination of restrictions. Eliminación de prohibiciones en la sociedad. And when you think about what this were, it's sort of sad that they had to be taken at all. This is, for example, the ability of Cubans to own secondhand cars, the ability to exchange real estate, the ability of Cubans to enter into tourist areas that were controlled by the tourism company. These were a series of prohibition on the sale and purchase of electronic products, TV sets, electric cookers. These are things that were prohibited in Cuba for no good reason, but nevertheless they were. And there was an effort during this period to eliminate a lot of those prohibiciones, which were really unnecessary and not really useful to anybody. And then there were some measures that were taken that are closer to what we call structural reforms, which sought to alter the socialist core of the system reducing the role of the state in the economy. And later on, this is being called by some of the Cuban leaders, disentangle economic impediments. This is the infamous destrabar la economía, or desatar los nudos que entorpecen el desarrollo de la fuerza productiva. And these, of course, are the more important policies. They're the ones that have broader change, and they are the ones that are longer acting, and they are the ones that have the most potential effect on the economy. To go very quickly on this, some of the structural reforms that happened during the Raúl's period were distribution of agricultural land in usufruct to individuals. This was a big deal. In 2000 and in the early 2000s, 2002, 2003, upwards of 60% of the agricultural land in Cuba was idle. This is land that had been held by cooperatives that had gone out of business. It was land that had been used by sugar mills that had been closed in the early 2000s when the industry was restructured. And it was just a tremendous amount of idle land that was overtaken by Marabú and other pests that were not leading to any productivity at all. So the idea here was to take this land, to divide it up into smaller parcels and to not deed it, but to give it in usufruct for a 10-year period to individuals who would commit to to use it for productive purposes. This was fairly effective. There was as usual, the thing was very restrictive from the beginning, very short periods of time, lots of restrictions that you couldn't build a shed on it, that you couldn't bring any agricultural equipment in. But eventually those were lifted and that worked out, had some success. Those of you who study sort of economic systems comparatively know that in both China and Vietnam, the idea of the usufruct in the agricultural sector was key to triggering their reforms. In China, it's called the contract responsibility system, which again didn't give the ownership of the land to the farmers, but it was sufficiently broad that farmers could go ahead and use it and make the necessary investments and so on. So that is still ongoing, but I think it's been quite successful. It's still problematic because the new farmers need the access to seed and to fertilizers and to inputs, which typically are not available to them. But that's been quite successful. The state sector was retrenched further under Raúl, and the number of occupations that could be carried out by self-employment increased. There were some changes also to the number of chairs. In Cuba, everything is very regulated. The number of seats that restaurants could have and so on and so forth. There was some flexibility put in there, but nevertheless, you still have the issue of a positive list. That is, only certain occupations that were identified by the Ministry of Labor were able to be performed. And they tended to be low productivity, low skill type activities as opposed to high tech and so on. There was some authorization for creation of non-agricultural cooperatives. Up to that time, the only cooperatives were in the agricultural field, and there was some opening to have cooperatives in, again, low skill, petty business, barbershops, sandwich shops. I mean, not a great opening, but better than before. There was also a new tax code that reduced red tape and reduced taxation for self-employed workers. And there was a new foreign investment code that simplified and expedited approval of foreign investments. However, unfinished when Raul left power in 2017, 2018, were kind of the biggies.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jorge. You have actually technically about 1 minute. I don't think you've been looking at your chat.
I haven't.
Just so
Okay,
you know, we're running out of time, okay?
Okay, so the pending issues were elimination of duality, monetary duality, an end to the rationing system, an enterprise reform, which hadn't happened yet, breakup of monopoly, and so on and so forth. Let me say, to conclude then, that there were high expectations for reforms under Raul, and there was no expectation that there'd be any political changes, and of course, no political changes came. But the changes over Raul were actually fairly modest when all is taken into account. Some of the laundry list of issues that needed to be done were incorporated into the lineamientos for 2011 to 2016, but there wasn't really the pace of reforms slowed down tremendously from 2012 on. The thorn relations with the US, as I mentioned earlier, raised expectations, but again, it didn't really result much at all. To conclude, and actually Larry hinted already at some of these things, with the new economic crisis that Cuba is facing right now, including COVID and so on, there is actually some movement domestically to try to make some of the reforms that were postponed before. And this is consistent with the way that Cuba works, which is to do things when they are really in a real bad way. And I've listed some of them here. I'm just gonna read them. There was a 10% surtax on the use of dollars, which has been eliminated. Some wholesale markets have been open. Some cafeterias and small stores will be converted into cooperatives. There's a modification to the foreign investment legislation that would allow for the first time foreign investors to own 100% of investments. And there's something going on, I guess, since January 1st of this year, something called ordenamiento monetario, which is finally a revamping of the elimination of the dual currency sector. So whether those things remain or not, whether they are implemented, remains to be seen. I'm sorry for running over, and look forward to some comments and reactions.
Oh, thank you, Jorge. I will now discuss the previous two papers. Actually, I'm going to essentially discuss one paper because that's the one I had in time. I will mention something about Larry's in passing. Let me get my my screen up here. All right, so my comments are going to be focused on Jorge's paper, Raul's Reforms, Actions, and Pending Agenda. This paper is really sort of the latest entry into or example of that's in a large body of work where Jorge has provided us the sort of empirical groundwork for studying the Cuban economy. And this work involves not just collection of data, but it's it's categorization, it's organization, and presenting it in a way that's very useful. Jorge has not just done this sort of the work that he's done here, but also a collection of a lot of numerical data that many of us have used. And Jorge has certainly done much more than his fair share of this kind of work. And I wanted to point out that this sort of work provides the foundation for empirical and theoretical analyses that follow. It's extremely valuable work, and it's often underappreciated in our profession. Now, I really have nothing to add to Jorge's description of the politics and actions taken since 2007. Or for that matter, I can't really add much to, or anything actually, to what Larry said about the effect of COVID. So I'm going to turn instead to my comparative advantage, which is to try to provide a sort of a rough framework or the beginnings of a framework for explaining the general outlines of these Cuban policies, not just since 2007, but going back to earlier in the revolution. And these are ideas that I certainly have been formulating for some time, and I think I first expressed them around 1994 at a conference that several of us attended in Washington, D.C. And the basic idea here is that authoritarian social regimes, and perhaps other types of regimes as well, often face a trade-off between growth and efficiency promoting policies, which essentially are going to require the abandonment of socialism and maintaining power. And in the presence of imperfect information, this tension between these two types of policies is going to introduce a certain amount of cyclicality into policymaking. And this is something that Jorge points out has been very common in Cuba. Now, the cyclicality may dampen on its own, but when combined with what I'm going to mention next, it can really sort of add to this sort of back and forth kind of effect. Now, an example of this would be, or at least I think it's partly an example of this, is the partial reversal in the latter 1990s of policies encouraging the creation of a limited private sector during the special period. Now, on this cyclical pattern, you have superimposed a variety of external shocks. And there are two types of, I said here two types. Actually, I actually list several of them, but I think in my mind classified them to two types. One, for example, is changes in external funding, such as Soviet or Venezuelan aid, and remittances would fall into that category also. So, for example, the loss of Soviet aid changed this balance between needing to promote efficiency and needing to maintain power. All of a sudden, having to promote efficiency became more important, and so the regime creates a limited private sector to deal with the crisis. Similarly, with the loss of Venezuelan aid, we see now policies that have led to an expansion of the private sector. Conversely, when Venezuelan aid appeared in I think it was the latter part of the 1990s, mostly, you saw a restriction of that private sector. U.S. trade sanctions probably work in a similar fashion through their impact on tourism. U.S. travel restrictions similarly, as those before it. And now things like the effect of COVID as a shock to tourism and so forth will also have an impact. Because if you reduce this sort of source of funding, they then are now more pressed to shift the trade-off more in favor of promoting the private sector and some of these reforms. Now, another effect would have been the disappearance of Cuba's Soviet patron, not just because of the support, but independently of support. I thought this for many years. This was quite important because when faced with this notion of we want to promote efficiency, but we also have to maintain power, and there's this tension there. What happens is that as they promote, as they liberalize the economy, for a variety of reasons that I can't get into here, there may be a potential loss of power. There may be uprisings. There may be disturbances, challenges to the regime, and so forth. Now, one possibility is to meet them with a big use of force, the way China did in Tiananmen Square. But this may be very difficult for Cuba to do after having lost its Soviet patron and its Soviet support, and consequently, they can't take the risk that something like that will happen. So they need to actually be stricter, less market oriented than even before. Another and final effect, which is sort of related to this one maybe, is the dying out of the revolutionary generation. The negative consequences of losing political control are greater for the generation that led the revolution. And as that generation dies out, and you already see it from the transition from Fidel to Raúl to the newer individuals, as those negative consequences diminish, you will probably see then a movement more toward more stress on moving toward the market mechanism and running a bigger risk of losing control. Now, let me say something about policy failure. There are sort of two general types of policies that Jorge discusses. One of those, you can sort of think of them as policies to make socialism more efficient. That is, you're still working within the socialist system, but trying to make it work better. And at least for me, it's very easy to see why these policies fail, and that's because it's an impossible task. This has never been achieved outside of Cuba or in the past or whatever, and they're not going to have any significant benefits other than maybe in the very short run. However, there are other policies that are more market oriented that have succeeded elsewhere. But these don't necessarily have done very well in Cuba, even when they haven't been reversed. And an example of this is that Jorge mentions is the use of fruit farming that has increased production elsewhere. Now, the framework that I'm providing, I think, helps explain that failure also, because the volatility and reversibility of policies in Cuba causes a problem for any sort of market-based solution. And in this particular case, I think the public has learned that the regime relaxes market restrictions when it is desperate and reverses them once the emergency is over. And in such an environment, you're not going to get the necessary investment effort and investment of capital to have this succeed. In places like Vietnam and China, I think the population has not had that experience. They've had these policies in place, and they've, if anything, expanded them over now several decades. And that has led to the belief that, yes, they will continue. And I think that helps explain why the policies have failed in Cuba. One other element that I wanted to mention here, and I incredibly just simply forgot to write it up before, is that if you're imposing policies that you're trying to sort of survive the immediate problem with the hope that once you survive the situation, things will improve and you'll be able to then sort of reverse them. You implement policies that have a lot of levers in them. So they have a lot of qualifications. We will allow you to open restaurants, but there will be all kinds of little things, little details. Now, why do you do that? I think partly you do that so that reversibility is easy. I don't have to sort of repeal everything. Okay, I first allowed restaurants, now I'm going to prohibit them. I can allow restaurants with a lot of restrictions and then decide which of those restrictions I'm going to enforce. And that gives you flexibility. But that itself tells you these are not permanent policies. And in that kind of environment, you're not going to have market policies, function very well. So actually, that's the extent of my my comments. Again, I think some of the features that Larry mentions in his presentation on COVID also fit this, the way the government, you know, has this trade-off that it has to face and so forth. But I think he is right that the pressures that COVID has done on the economic side of reducing tourism and so forth have put pressure on it to have to expand the private sector, just like the collapse of the Soviet Union, the loss of Venezuelan aid have done in the past. Yeah. All right. Well, that's it. So I think I've gained back some of the time that you guys have lost. On the next two papers, please look at your chat every once in a while so you can see when I'm telling you that, you know, you have 5 minutes left or 2 minutes left or what have you. Okay. I don't want to have to cut you off. Okay. So the next paper will be by Luis of International Research and Strategy Associates. And it's Venezuelan Cuban mutual aid, grants, subsidies, and fantasies.
Thank you, Luis. Let me try to share my screen.
Are you able to?
Yeah.
Yes, good. Okay.
Yep. So the title of my paper is Venezuelan Cuban Mutual Aid, Grants, Subsidies, and Fantasies. And this is a topic that I've been working on for many years, and many other people have worked on it. And it is the nature of the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela, and also what the impact of this may be. Now, I do not really get into the question of calculating an impact, because I believe one has to understand the transfer of resources before you get there. But let me look then at the nature of the Cuba-Venezuela relationship. It has many dimensions, and if you look at the documents that this relationship entails, and this goes back to the beginning of the Chavez regime in 1999, one sees that it's driven by a political relationship. It's a political and security alliance, and they don't make any bones about this, that this is the heart of the relationship. Economics is second fiddle, it's not the essence of it, but it is critical to Cuba in terms of the supply of oil. Venezuela is the main supplier of oil, for which, for most of the period since 1999, has involved a very large grant element. In other words, it's been a subsidized element. And now the comparison, as previous speakers indicated, is with the Soviet period, where there was a very significant grant element to trade, as well as direct aid from the Soviet Union. I'm not going to compare in this paper, but in previous work, essentially the relationship is like 6 to 1. The maximum grant element of Venezuela is something like between 1/5 and 1/6 of the maximum element yearly that the Soviet Union provided to Cuba. So we're talking about very different dimensions, but nonetheless very important. So this agreement is a mutual aid agreement to foster political and economic goals. And now this relationship evolved very rapidly into a barter arrangement of oil for so-called Cuban professional services. Now these professional services are a mix of services. The most important one in terms of the flow of resources is the medical services, doctors and other health personnel. But alongside this, there's been a very important element of security services. The Cubans advise the government on internal security. They also have run computer systems and software for the National Identification Program, and many other elements. When one looks at some of the smaller economically elements, they are very important on the security element of the relationship. Now, the problem with analyzing this is that there are important bilateral trade surpluses on either side, actually switch over the years, but we don't really know how these trade surpluses are compensated. In other words, we don't really know what in the more recent years there is being a Cuban surplus, and we do not understand very well how this bilateral Cuban surplus is compensated. I mean, there are some references to this. The original agreement signed in 2004 between Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro talks about, in a way, about bartering. And then there are some documents from PDVSA, the oil company, that talks about how to settle when Venezuela had a clear surplus and the oil price was very high, and Venezuela was sending 130,000 barrels per day to Cuba. There had been a surplus, and it talks a little bit about the compensation mechanism, but it remains nebulous. So in any case, what I want to look at is the importance of the bilateral relationship to each country and the implied subsidies. And I want to shed light into the resource transfers. We need to understand this before we can measure what the impact is in any precise way. Now, one way to look at it is look at what's happened to oil flow from Venezuela to Cuba. And we see on the blue line is Venezuela oil output. The red line is oil volume sent to Cuba. Now, I just found a surprise a week ago. And it is that experts had believed that Venezuela was shipping about 65,000 barrels per day to Cuba in 2019. But numbers just published in Cuba imply about 100,000 barrels per day shipped to Cuba. And so what's going on? I've talked to some experts about these latest numbers, and they believe that there's been transshipment out of Cuba. In other words, the difference between 100,000 per day and 65,000 is transshipment from Cuba to third countries. And they've mentioned Asia, places like India and Singapore, for instance. The problem is, when I looked at the Cubans haven't published very clear data, but they have published bilateral trade data. And the interesting thing is that Cuba had only like $3 million exports to India in 2019. So this transshipment couldn't have taken place, at least it's not registered. So what this means is that there is an unknown here as to what happened to this very large flow that was unexpected in 2019. Now, this is partly explained because Venezuela has had problems exporting oil to the US and other markets, and there have been some deviation. But I'm counting the entire shipment, which is about 100,000 barrels a day, as what Cuba receives in 2019. In any case, the decline of shipment to Cuba is correlated with the fall in oil production. Now, I'm not going to enter into detail about Venezuelan indicators of trade with Cuba, but we see that oil exports in barrels have been declining since 2012. 2012, by the way, was a peak year of in terms of value, because oil prices were quite high in 2012, of shipments from Venezuela to Cuba, and the volume has been declining, and I cannot actually see my own number here. In 2019, 30-some million barrels, I guess. And so as a percent of GDP, these are quite small for Venezuela, even to this time. As a proportion of exports, they have increased a bit, as well as oil production. But the interesting number is the proportion of imports, and I cannot really see my number here, but it's about a third. So the opportunity cost of the shipments to Cuba is very high. In other words, they represent a significant part of imports, particularly very recently. So that is the most interesting point. Now, I'm not going to talk about the Venezuelan economy. There's been a collapse in production. GDP per capita has declined much less than half what it was in 2012, and inflation the economy suffered hyperinflation in 2017 and 18, continues in 19 and 2020. As I see the numbers for this year, it looks the average monthly inflation is a little bit below 30% per month. So it's in a hyperinflationary condition, but they're controlled prices. So it's even the numbers that are estimated in Venezuela are essentially not market clearing prices. So the economy is in a state of collapse and decimated by hyperinflation. Now, the importance of trade with Cuba is we see from the side of exports, Venezuelan exports, imports of Cuban services have oscillated between close to 8 billion and around 6 billion. So they're quite significant. Now, these are the numbers that are registered by the Cuban government. In other words, these are the recorded balance of payments numbers. And we derive these numbers actually as a residual. So they are not directly recorded. They are estimated by looking at the national accounts actually, and overall services exports, and then finding out what the Venezuelan share is as a residual. But they remain quite high. So on the face of it, Cuba is still providing Venezuela with a large flow of services that constitute the most important nominally source of export income in Cuba. Now, all of this implies that Venezuelan imports of Cuban services are a very important part of the economy. They were 9% of GDP in 2013. They declined somewhat to around 6%. I cannot see my number. I'm sorry, I'm blocking my own table. And so I also calculated the percentage of total services exports, which include tourism. They remain quite high, and of Cuba's BIA's assets. Now, when I calculated the Venezuelan number, I looked at the other important customers of the Cuban government for services, for professional services exports, and they dwarf by a huge amount the services provided to Venezuela. So Brazil is the second most important one, and we really have hard numbers for Brazil, because Brazilians have published exactly the number and salaries paid to Cubans in Brazil. And so the average for the 2013-18 was about $370 million for Brazil, compared to figures for Venezuela that were roughly between 6 and 8.5 billion per year. So Venezuela dwarfs all other sources of income in terms of professional exports. We were able to find some data for Algeria, Angola. Algeria and Angola are the second and third countries in terms of services. And again, they are in the region for Angola about $90 million per year, and Algeria a little bit less. They have been published in the official the official government journal of Algeria, and they have been published in Angola. So they are quite small. Now, the Gulf here, we include 3 countries, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. And this is an estimate. We haven't seen the same budget numbers as in these two. But what all this means is Venezuela gets 90% of the revenue from, about 90% of the revenue of professional exports from Venezuela. Cuba gets 90% from a single country. So this is very important for what Larry was mentioning, what's going on with the doctors going to treat COVID patients. And what happens is that most of these countries are not able to pay in dollars. They essentially are not providing Cuba with high revenue. Now, going back to the Venezuela-Cuba relationship, I look at different measures of the balance of the relationship. The traditional measurement would be the bilateral trade surplus, and this has oscillated around 5 billion in recent years. We don't have a precise estimate for 2019, but it probably was just a bit less than in 2018. Now, the barter oil grant is a measure of the value of barter. And to do that, I look at oil versus professional services. In order to gauge the value of the professional services, I use the market rate for doctors. And the data we have is from Brazil, which publishes the salaries paid to Cuban doctors. So I use the Brazilian wage, average salary paid to Cuban doctors as the gauge of how much should Venezuelan doctors be getting if they're getting a market price. Of course, you can argue Brazil is not Venezuela and so forth, but at least it provides a market signal. And when you do that, the subsidy implied in this grant by means of the balance of barter is very small. Now, oil prices went up in 2018, so this provided a big shift in the barter grant. Now, the full grant component is essentially if you take the Cuban invoicing at full value. In other words, if Venezuela is paying what Cuba says it owes it, and it's recorded in the overall services account, then these numbers are very large. And the number for 2019, we haven't been able to refine it because the data just came out, but it's in the order of maybe a little bit less than 5 billion. So now we don't know about 2020, but these are very large numbers. And essentially they amount in 2018 to about 5.5% of GDP. And the question is this full grant component realized or not? Is it really a fantasy or is it real? In other words, is Venezuela being able to provide payment for the trade surplus and the full grant that is embedded in the trade surplus? And essentially, we don't really know exactly, but we do know about the financial situation of Venezuela, and we can make an educated guess. So one way to look at it, these are exports of professional services. Now we know how much Venezuela is shipping in oil, and here I'm including the total amount. In other words, that probably includes some transshipment. The transshipment, one can look at, for instance, at the IMF's direction of trade, and the transshipment amount last year was around 12,000 barrels per day. That's the amount that is a discrepancy in the series. So that's probably the minimum transshipment. The experts estimated last year, 2019, I should say, was around 35,000 barrels per day. So it's something in between. But here I'm including all of it. So the rest is the part that needs to be paid in cash. Now, when you look way back to Venezuela, like in 2012, Cuba between 2011 and 2012 had a huge buildup of liquidity. And you can see that by looking at international banking statistics. And this evidently must have come from Venezuela because it's another source of liquidity. So Venezuela was paying earlier on, I don't have the 2012 numbers here, but earlier on, it probably was transferring Cuba the bulk of Cuba's surplus with Venezuela. As Venezuela's economic situation deteriorated, the question is how much of it is paying in hard currency. Let's see, Jorge, I cannot. Oh, I don't know. I thought he was sending me a message. So the question is how much of this is Venezuela able to transfer in terms of dollars or hard currency, and how much of it is de facto being financed by Cuba. It looks odd that Cuba would have become a creditor to Venezuela, but this is what this implies. And it's difficult to grasp, but now I looked at the international asset position of Cuba and Venezuela, and we see this is the data from the BIS. So it's banking data. I'm not using reserve data.
You have about 1 minute, okay?
Okay, so essentially we see that the financial position of Venezuela is been declining over time to a very low level, and it's now matching the level of Cuban assets itself. But the key element is to look at Cuban imports. This is I look at the Cuban import data, which is now down in the first quarter of this year, about 51% from 2018. This is sort of the budget constraint, because essentially Cuba must import essential goods, and the budget constraint is expressed in Cuban merchandise imports, which imply that there is a dollar shortage, of course. Now, if Venezuela were paying the surplus that Cuba has, Cuba wouldn't have such a low level of imports. And so again, we cannot pinpoint it. And I'm not going to look at this. This is so essential conclusions are that Cuba has a bilateral trade surplus with Venezuela at a high level. The question is how much of this implicit subsidy is actually paid out, and it doesn't look from current data that that it's been effectively paid out in the last 2 years, 2 or 3 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker will be Vadim Grishin of George Washington University, who will speak on Venezuela and Cuba inside a perfect storm of sanctions, corporate politics, and changing economic policy. Vadim, I will send you via the chat when you have 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left, and 1 minute left, okay?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for the honor of the invitation. Distinguished speakers of our panel have already described channels through which present asymmetric dependency between Cuba and Venezuela has added uncertainties and vulnerabilities to both nations in these times of current global upheaval. We can likely better understand the consequences of ongoing events.
Let me talk to Vadim. Vadim, you don't have it on slideshow yet, you know?
Oh, really? Sorry.
Hit slideshow. To your right, up above. You're on themes, move to the right. No, move to the right.
Yeah. Here.
Where it says slideshow.
Down here.
No, I'm on top. You see where it says home, then it says themes, tables, charts. You can see that?
Yeah.
Now go to the right further till you get to slideshow.
Yeah.
Right there. Okay, hit slideshow and then hit from start. No, that didn't work.
Sorry about this.
You have to hit slideshow. Yeah.
No, it doesn't work.
Click that. Click on slideshow.
Okay, yeah, it's
Click-
working.
No, it's not. Not yet. Can you click on slideshow?
Yeah, it's working, but slow.
I don't see it here.
But can you see the data?
Yeah, we can see the slides, but you don't have it in a slideshow presentation. You don't see where it says slideshow on the right, on the top? So, okay, go to the far left. Go to the far left where it says from start. Right there. Click on that. There you go. There you go. Let's see. There we go. Okay.
Very good. So I will do several bullet points in my presentation here, which likely will not be fully complete, but hopefully will enable to have a wider discussion. My first bullet point is the following. Whatever methodology we apply, whether using a structural approach or resource curse concept or an institutional equilibrium method, among others, all of them identify Venezuela as a topical petrostate, heavily dependent on commodity exports, on an exporting sector rather than revenue from taxation, with mismanaged and corrupt institutions, and a non-diversified and de-industrialized economy. The current political regime has dramatically worsened all the weak spots of its resource curse. Suffice it to say that Venezuela's average GDP growth during the last 10 years was about -9%. The first evident conclusion from the table of the GDP growth is that Venezuela has lost half a century of development, and during the last 40 years, it has experienced a negative growth of -2%. My second point here is that the country has literally dropped into a downfall economic vortex every 4 years, and since 2012, it has dropped into a free fall. Such a plunge during a peacetime crisis started long before serious US sanctions were imposed, during a period when oil prices were still high and national crude oil production was relatively stable. Such extremely high economic volatility decoupled Venezuela's GDP growth from oil price cycles and revealed an accumulation of institutional and structural issues, so that rising oil prices didn't translate into rising crude production. Therefore, rather popular thesis that Venezuela's economic crisis is an imported product, la crisis económica es un producto importado, is not relevant. It is not only the frequency of growth failures that draws attention, but also the depth of the decline compared to peer countries in the Latin American region. Here we can see maybe the most important chart for any petrostate, Venezuela's crude oil production. In the 90s, we can easily notice the amazing phenomenon, first of all, despite very low oil prices, growing production. The country's production increased by 1 million barrels per day from 1993 to 1998. There are several factors behind this phenomenon. First of all, a growing demand for Venezuela oil on the US market, a significant net influence of foreign direct investments into the country. And thirdly, we should admit that in the 90s, Venezuelan economy was free market oriented and much more attractive for investors than many other regional economies. during this period of 90s, a major modernization of the US refining industry happened with investment of about 100 billion US dollars. As a result of this modernization, many US refineries were attached to heavy grades of oil, and Venezuela moved into the third place among oil exporting countries to the US market. Venezuela's oil was also cheap, sold to the US at significant discount. It was this strong dependence that, among other factors, prevented the US from applying tough sanctions against the Chavez regime when it's expropriated some US assets in the mid-2000s. It's clear that Chavez regime did not, we can see here net influence, the growth in 90s, in the previous slide, the growing imports from Venezuela to the US market, and here the mix of economics and politics. In any case, it's clear that Chavez regime did not emerge from a vacuum. In Venezuela of the 80s and 90s, development failures were accompanied by weakening democratic and economic institutions that finally created a very favorable environment for the rise of a populist leader like Chavez. The volatility and decline in production that followed Chavez's ascent to power is due to a significant change in the ownership structure of the oil industry and the redistribution of financial flows in favor of the state, accompanied by mismanagement, corruption, declining productivity, labor, and political instability. Much more mysterious is an appearance of the famous plateau of production that existed from 2003 to 2015, despite the partial nationalization of the oil industry, global financial crisis, declining FDIs, the departure of some old and the entry of new corporate players, especially national oil companies, NOCs, from China and Russia. We can explain this phenomenon by the formation of a new balance between geopolitical and commercial factors, and we will talk about them a little bit later. In my third point here, I'd like to mention that over the past decade, Venezuela has experienced a significant loss of accumulated national wealth, and GDP per capita has declined by more than half. In that regard, one can hear arguments that the country has nowhere further to fall, and its predicament will eventually become a launching pad for a new revival in the country after it goes through regime change. However, the experience of deep structural transformations, including post-communist transit in Europe and Eurasia, show that a transitional recession will almost be inevitable, even if it proves to be short. These prospects will apply to the future Cuban transition as well. Venezuela has long been an oil country, and many efforts have been made to diversify its economy. We don't have time to discuss pretty evident reasons behind this failure. There is a more enigmatic and difficult phenomenon to explain, which is why the regime was not able to invest in the oil sector in the time of commodity supercycle. Frankly speaking, I was initially taken aback when I saw PDVSA's strategic plan outlined in its 2008 financial report, projecting an increase in crude production to 5 million barrels per day by 2013 and 6.5 MBPD by 2021. I believe the reality was quite different. The World Bank has defined such forecast errors with a huge divergence of performance from expectations as a gross disappointment effect. A remarkable feature about PDVSA performance was the combination of declining production and stagnant and declining sales, even in the context of rising prices and rising reserves. Despite enormous development opportunities in the Orinoco Belt, a negative growth multiplier emerged that could have been named the Chavez coefficient or the Maduro moment. Ultimately, Venezuela regime intentionally and unintentionally ended up underinvesting in the oil sector. Undoubtedly, the reason behind such a policy includes chronic corruption. Venezuela has been among bottom countries of corruption perception index since early 2000s, short-term group interest, a costly foreign policy. In fact, there have been also declining, we can see it here, FDIs, and limited influence of private money besides direct investment to the country in the 2000s, and substantial country outflows, capital outflows. Despite tightening currency controls, the average balance of capital movement in the 2010s has remained negative. Net outflows were in a range of 5 billion to 35 billion US dollars annually. Consequently, and not surprisingly, crude production experienced an accelerated decline starting from 2015, and the regime successfully sold off the branch on which it was sitting. If we look at the non-oil sector, which was predominantly owned and operated by the private capital, we see that state dirigism and administrative pressure was practiced for over 20 years. Among other things, regime nationalized businesses, determined the exchange rate, and set the price of basic goods that have accelerated the country's drive toward a full-fledged economic collapse. As a result of such policies, a private sector share in GDP dropped from 65% when Chavez came to power to less than 40% of GDP 20 years later. Private sector share, Such a development was not a coincidence. According to the World Bank, it's here, a study in this slide, it's almost impossible to start a business legally in the country. Venezuela's rank in easy for starting business is 190 out of 190 countries in the world. In 2019, Maduro put forward a new economic program, which some loyalists called a tropical China, a kind of business liberalization with relaxed state interference and declining regulation for fighting shortages of goods. This unexpected shift, supported by Venezuela's business and political elite, has brought a sense of relief, especially to those who have relied on dollar remittances from abroad. Now there is amount as around $4 billion US per year. On the one hand, it's a replica of Cuba's approach to flows of remittances. On the other hand, the roots of this recent policy by Maduro can be found in Bolsheviks' economic practice, so-called NAP, introduced by Lenin after the bloody Russian Civil War 100 years ago in 1921. Maneuvers of a similar kind under the current regime in Venezuela are timid and non-sustainable, and they have been accompanied by political repressions and the destruction of the country's remaining democratic institutions. The COVID pandemic has also limited implementation of recent economic policies there. It would seem evident that any substantial economic progress would be possible only with deep political transformation. The current system is exhausted. It can't generate economic growth or reach any political settlement. And now, let me come back to oil production that, as we see, experience a chronic decline starting in 2015. The question is, why 2015? The first, most obvious answer is that the commodity supercycle has ended and oil prices have been plunged since 2014. The second point is related to the new balance of geopolitical risks and commercial interests. In this period, Russian and Chinese oil companies landed in Venezuela. The arrival of Chinese and Russian players was accompanied by a sharp increase in the country's debt burden. In this context, falling oil revenues led to a PDVSA technical default in 2017. Paradoxically, before Washington oil embargo, Venezuela received significant part of its cash from the United States, while oil exports to China and Russia were used to pay Venezuela's debt to these two countries. Another factor that significantly changed geopolitics and geoeconomics was a declining dependence of US refineries on Venezuela's oil as a result of growing import of heavy crude oil, mostly from Canada and partially from Russia. In sum, an opinion that Western sanctions were the major cause of the oil production collapse in Venezuela is an evident simplification. The sharp decline in direct investments, the dramatic drop of oil prices, flight of capital, extremely inefficient management, outdated equipment, constraints and destruction of the private sector activities. These negative developments inevitably led to the dramatic contraction of the oil production and economic growth. And it seems logical that sanctions have accelerated these disastrous processes. Due to time constraint, I will limit myself by several additional comments about sectorial sanctions in the context of corporate sector activities in Venezuela. Overall, sanctions are a mix of geopolitics, business interest, and a broader non-commercial interest. Such a mix is different in IOCs and NOCs. Let's start with the leading IOCs, Chevron. We know that until recently, this American company managed to get a waiver for its joint venture production in Venezuela after sanctions were imposed, which kept the country's crude production afloat. The reasons for this inconsistency are understandable. Chevron not only fought to maintain its profits and privileged commercial goals, but also hedged against the potential risk of having Chinese and Russian oil companies seize its production facilities. Thus, there were commercial corporate interests entangled with the US geopolitical interests. Such situations are usual for IOCs owned by private capital. The commercial component of IOC activities is normally visible and palpable. NOCs, national oil companies owned by the state, are different and tend to be much more sensitive to non-commercial goals, and they are obedient to decisions made by the political leadership in countries as China and Russia. Nevertheless, in the case of Venezuela, we can see different patterns of behavior on the part of Chinese and Russian NOCs. Chinese companies are more cautious and try to avoid direct challenging US sanctions. They demonstrate their desire to preserve access to Venezuela's oil market and want to repay for their outstanding loan of about $20 billion US. As we can see on the next slide, oh, I'm sorry, but believe me that Beijing has significantly reduced its oil imports from Venezuela in 2018 and 2019. It's yellow color. China representatives have also held informal contacts with the country opposition and personally with Guaido. Here, it's important to note that all political forces in Venezuela, both the government and the opposition, see China not only as a current lender or joint venture partner, but also a potential future strategic investor for rebuilding the country's oil industry. The role that Russia's NOCs, Rosneft, played in Venezuela was remarkably different. Rosneft is not just an instrument in the hands of the Russian political leadership. It became a key actor that sometimes even determined Russia's foreign policy decisions because of the very special position of the company's CEO, Mr. Igor Sechin. Rosneft commercial activity has always been intertwined with domestic political affairs and the ambitious geopolitical goals pursued by the Kremlin. At the same time, Rosneft can't completely neglect its commercial goal to avoid the extreme predicament of becoming cannibalized by Russian politics.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
You have only about 1 minute left, okay? So you
Final-
you can wrap it up.
Final summary. Rosneft, and as we know, under pressure of the US sanctions, sold all its joint ventures, service companies, and trading operations to another Russian state-owned entity. In return, it received almost 10% share of its own equity, currently worth almost $4 billion US. And Rosneft has also profited from a reduction in Venezuelan production and from the imposition of a US oil embargo by acting together with Canadian companies as a replacement for Venezuela's heavy crude exports to the US. That US market is important for Rosneft because the company received cash payment. Summarizing, my presentation has focused mainly on the overwhelming structural crisis in Venezuela, where a petrostate has crashed and an authoritarian regime has flirted with ideas of tropical socialism. The country's fundamental problem comes from the oil-dependent nature of the Venezuelan state, whose extremely inefficient and corrupt forms of governments have become mixed with the destructive practical of authoritarian populism. In that regard, the Cuban experience has been quite different. Unfortunately, I don't have time to describe my view on the process of Cuban reforms in comparison with the reforms in Europe and Eurasia, but I would like to stress ultimately that we can see some similarities in the transitional agendas of these two countries, Cuba and Venezuela. However, the transitional pathways will likely be rather different. Let me stop here, and I'm looking forward for our discussion and Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vadim. Jose Pineda will be the discussant from the University of British Columbia. We discussed of the last two papers. Jose, you have 12 minutes scheduled. However, if you take the full 12 minutes, there will be 0 minutes for discussion. So if you can do it any faster than that, that would be a good thing.
Yes, I will try to do my best.
Thank you.
I will have my comments on the two papers. I will go first with the paper by Luis. And I will just do a very my own version of the summary of what I think the paper tried to do. I think that the paper, I think, very carefully highlights that the main goal of the relationship between Venezuela and Cuba are mostly to strengthen each other's regime. And I think Luis put the emphasis that political alliances was first, and then economic relationships were the second, although the economic component is the one that fuel the political relationships. I like a lot the way he tries to estimate this effective transfer of resources across both countries, and the idea of the bilateral oil grant where there is a bilateral trade where Venezuela sends oil and Cuba sends professional services. That's one first kind of estimation of the relationship, but then he also presents what could be called as the full grant component, in which he captures the difference between what are the Cuban services that are exported to Venezuela, or at least registered to be exported to Venezuela, compared to his market value. And I think these two elements are very important to calibrate, to have a measure. I think Luis made a great effort to quantify them, and I will just have a few comments in a second. So I think after presenting these numbers, Luis make a series of reflections, which I think are really critical. He says, okay, the effective subsidy coming from Venezuela to Cuba will depend on the Venezuelan's capacity to actually settle all of these bilateral surpluses in hard cash or whatever Venezuelan ability to actually pay any debt obligation to Cuba that may result to this. And I think that's an important question, and that goes to the last point to Luis' conclusion. But let me just add that by presenting the numbers, he also highlighted the fragility to the Cuban economy from his dependency to Venezuela. So I think that understanding these numbers are important not only for the Venezuelan point of view, but also from the Cuban point of view because of the fragility that this could have. And his final conclusion, which I share, and I will make my comments in a second, is that this high price for professional services that are exported to Venezuela is neither realistic nor sustainable. And I think that is a very important conclusion, and I will add something in my comments. So the first comment that I wanted to make is just to put things into perspective that concessional oil prices existed before. I think that Luis has pointed out really well that maybe what is new is the political dependency, maybe the generosity and the intensity of these concessional prices, because we know from history that the San Jose Pact between Venezuela and Mexico to sell oil and on concessional prices to many countries, including Cuba, was already there. But I think what is new is this generosity and the intensity due to the political dependency that is well mentioned by Luis. I just have one small comment about the production numbers, just a small detail. I wanted to concentrate on the last 2 points of my comments. One is the calculations made by Luis depend critically on using the right salaries. And I know he's doing his best. I'm not trying to criticize, but my question is, it could also be the case that the wages paid in Brazil are overpriced. So using Brazil is better, of course, but maybe there is also an overpricing there. And my question was, I'm trying to see, because all of the numbers presented are in terms of US dollars, maybe if we have numbers presented in terms of people, we could see if the ratios of how much is paid across countries relate to how much actually US dollars are supposed to be invoiced or be paid. And maybe that could also help Luis to refine the calculations to see what could be the actual extent of the subsidies. And finally, I think this is a personal reflection, but I think we are concentrating by checking this possibility that Venezuela could pay the debt. And my conclusion is that this debt will not be paid, either because the inability of Maduro's regime, either by what Bedin has been saying, Luis and many others about the Venezuelan collapse. So the Maduro regime will not be able to put hard currency to these payments, but also the willingness. And I think the willingness is coming from any future government. The opposition will definitely not be willing to pay any of this debt. And maybe for future discussion, will be good to see the cumulative results, because maybe in the cumulative results, even if we see that some of these recent surpluses for Cuba will not be settled, maybe if we see the cumulative results and the cumulative payments in cash or oil as a hard currency payment, we could see that it's still Venezuela could say that the net effect cumulative will be positive for Cuba. So that will be not only a reason for not paying any debt that the Cuban government could present to any future opposition government, but also something that the opposition may claim, saying, you know what, the cumulative result is favorable to Cuba. So it makes no sense for us to even consider any of these potential withstanding debt that we may have. So let me move quickly to the second paper, okay, by Vadim. I will make my comments mostly on a brief summary that Vadim shared with me, which has a little bit of some additional elements about the policy reaction after COVID by the Venezuelan authorities. And I think that what I like about Vadim's presentation is that he described a lot of the factors that he called as the perfect storm for Venezuela. So the Venezuelan collapse is the sum of many factors that Vadim actually summarized relatively well in his presentation. But also, I think it is important that he puts the U.S. sanction in the right place. And he says, these U.S. sanctions come long after the collapse was, the melting down of the Venezuelan economy was happening. And I think that is a very important mention that he does. I think also he talks about this zigzag trend in economic policies in the Maduro regime. And I think I will borrow from Luis Loque his comment about this Venezuelan authorities are borrowing from Cuba this tendency of having reforms only when their back is against the wall and they have to do something, but they do it in a way that reversal is very handy. And I think that is something that is mentioned by Vadim, but also is something that I can rescue from previous comments. His conclusion on the notes that he shared with me were that, and I totally agree, that the Venezuelan policies are unsustainable and they may only bring some temporary relief to the economy. And I will make a few comments on that. And he also mentioned that any economic policy changes will have not any improvement on the political side. On the contrary, political repression will increase to reduce any potential vestige of organized opposition. On the Cuban side that he didn't mention, he says that, of course, this Venezuelan collapse and the COVID may trigger a new set of reforms. And the last point that he mentioned is that, as we see, that Cuba could be taking high risk, long delayed policy reforms, starting with exchange rate unification. So let me just make a couple of comments just to save time. And the first thing that I wanted to say is that liberalizing policies, I think, is not 100% accurate term in Venezuela. I like the zigzag and the partial reform, as Luis Loque mentioned it, with a lot of restrictions so that you could easily reverse. And I think there is also a component of money laundering about this new liberalization of particular retail sectors in Venezuela. I think the new measures in Venezuela are also making things worse for the poor, because it has led to a dollarization process where many of the poor people have lack access to those. And that has increased their dependency towards government subsidies and toward remittances, but these remittances were significantly affected by COVID-19 and all the effects in the hosting countries of Venezuelans. And the final point that I wanted to make is that maybe this exchange rate unification may also have a negative impact on the pricing of Cuba's export services, because I think this thing that the dual regime plays in a role in how much you invoice abroad or how much you actually pay to your workers may be a factor that trying to combine the two papers, that could be a factor that could play into the future. So I want to close here because I know there is not too much time, and I hope I didn't take too much, Luis.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are unfortunately pretty much out of time. I think we've got 1 minute. I'm not sure how long we'll be able to continue. it's not going to be open for question and answer from anyone else, anyone. I'm not sure what to expect here, though. I think we may just be out of time. I'm not sure here. It is now 12 o'clock, so let me just ask them if we're out of time. I'm not getting anything from the support. Okay, well, are there any questions? Any comments? I'm not getting anything from anyone.
Well, I can make a very brief comment on the point Jose Pineda
Yes,
made
we're done.
about.
The support just said we're done, so
Okay,
I'm not
all
sure.
right,
What that
yeah.
means. Does that mean they're gonna shut us off, or does it mean we can keep on talking among ourselves? I don't know what that means.
Well, look, I think it was a very good session, and I want to
Go ahead.
everybody who attended. I thought it was a great presentation. The two sets of papers matched very nicely, and it was well done. Thank you to all of you, and it's great to see you.
Well, thank you all for participating.
Luis, you can write me and we can exchange.
Yeah, sure.
Same thing. Huh?
Yeah.